Please be seated. So the first time I took the Myers-Briggs type indicator test was with a group in college preparing for a summer mission trip in Kenya. The MBTI, if you don't know, is a kind of personality test that some people seem to think can read one's emotional predispositions toward the world as precisely as an MRI can scan your physical innards. I assume we took it because these leaders somehow thought there might be some potential for conflict and drama among a dozen 18 to 20-year-old co-eds about to spend 10 weeks together in close, uncomfortable quarters without access to television or Burger King. I think I remember what my type was, INTP, if you must know. But there's only one question on the whole test I can remember even the gist of. It's the one where they ask you whether you tend to replay conversations in your mind until you come up with the perfect response you wished you'd made the first time around. I remember that question because that's pretty much how I spend all my waking life. Anybody else here ever fantasize about that perfect reply, about setting somebody perfectly straight? It's only in recent years I've come to feel a little more comfortable confessing this neurosis of mine in public. Mostly because Mark Zuckerberg became a bazillionaire by inventing this online platform for us to set everybody else straight. If nothing else, Facebook proves I'm not alone in my fantasies. But I've come to believe that this tendency to create another narrative, one in which I get a starring role as the defender of the good and the true, is really just kind of a sad, grown-up version of those stories I'd spin in my childhood mind. Back then, I'd be running around on the dirt pile behind the Nethertons' house, saving the world by fending off imagined bad guys with a big stick. Is it really so different to imagine that your thick-headed friend will finally concede your perfectly argued case on that ongoing debate over military spending or abortion? In this fantasy, to hear him say, "You know, Scott, you're absolutely right." That provides about the same satisfaction as slaying 50 orcs with Bilbo Baggins. It's all about defending goodness and truth, right? Okay, you'd be forgiven for asking, yeah, but what in the world has any of this to do with Lent or Noah? Well, there's a perception in this world, I think, that it's become a much more morally ambiguous place in recent times. We think that in days gone by, people knew right from wrong. They knew the good guys from the bad guys. And maybe we think our stories used to be clearer about all this too, but this may not be the case. I recently came across an article by Catherine Nichols titled "The Good Guy, Bad Guy Myth." And in it, she points out that stories from oral traditions rarely had anything like the modern good guy or bad guy in them. She asks us, in Jack and the Beanstalk or Sleeping Beauty, who's the good guy? Jack is the protagonist we're meant to root for, yet he has no ethical justification for stealing all the giant's things. Does Sleeping Beauty care about goodness? Does anyone fight crime? She cites Hamlet and the Iliad and the Three Little Pigs and a lot more to argue that our simple good guy, bad guy narratives might be a fairly recent invention. And as satisfying as they may be, they may not serve us so well in the world we actually inhabit. We know that many of the stories in the Bible began from an oral tradition, and there's a decent chance that the first time you read the Old Testament for yourself, you were a little upset by some of the characters' behaviors. Characters you thought were supposed to be the obvious heroes in the story, good guys. Characters like, well, God. The actions of God in the Bible have confused many a Christian over time. But is there any usable wisdom here? So consider the story of Noah and the flood. Step back from what you think it's all about. Maybe step out of our good guy, bad guy storytelling world and listen to it again. The story certainly has to do with the problem of good and evil. We're only a few chapters into Genesis. God has created the heavens and the earth and humankind and all forms of life. And then we humans kind of muck things up with our freedom and our sin. By chapter 4, the first brothers have fallen into jealousy, and Cain has murdered Abel. By chapter 6, we read this: "The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he made humankind on the earth. It grieved him to his heart." And so God vows to uncreate the earth. God will return things to that watery chaos from which they came: people, animals, creeping things, and all. We know the rest. Not quite everything will go after all. Noah builds the ark out of gopher wood to the scorn of his neighbors. We remember the animals boarding 2 by 2 and the horrible deluge that does this terrible cleansing work God threatened. Noah and his family, we remember, waiting for the waters to recede and for that dove to find dry ground. But it is in the strange conclusion which we read today that we really may see the modern good guy, bad guy pattern conspicuously missing. Because God began this story in a state of regret. God was sorry that the project of making humans ever happened. But rather than celebrating the great cleansing of the world of evil that has just taken place, God says soberly, "Noah, I will never, ever do this again. I promise." Rather than riding off triumphantly into the sunset of a world made right, God hangs God's bow in the clouds. The divine weapon is now unstrung and pointed away from the earth. It will hang there, not just as a reminder to us, but to God. Every time God sees the rainbow, the story says, God will remember the covenant. A covenant that, interestingly enough, asked nothing of sinful humankind. It's a covenant in which God simply said, "This is the sign of the covenant I've established between me and all flesh that's on the earth. I will not destroy my creatures again, even though I know you're going to go right on sinning." Nothing changes in the human heart in this story that we know of. Did you notice that? Nothing changes in the story except, so it seems, God. We don't really end our stories this way, do we? We don't tell stories in which the good guy regrets past actions, relinquishes power, hangs up the weapon just wielded to fight the evildoers. We don't tell many stories like that, do we? But the Bible does. And as a Christian, I can't help but see the way of the cross and this letting go of violence within the heart of God. I can't help but see the way of Jesus, refusing to accept the terms of a violent world to free us from the power of sin. And as this season of Lent begins, I wonder what this story, which asks nothing of humanity with regard to that covenant, does ask of me in a response. If God can set God's bow in the clouds and say, "Never again will I fight sin this way," what might I need to relinquish in my life? Well, for beginners, I may need to relinquish the certainty that I'm the one who sees clearly enough to set all things straight and begin to cultivate a little more mercy in myself. Because that's what God exchanges the bow for, isn't it? Mercy. Mercy will be God's weapon of choice from here on. I have to say, I wish I knew what choosing the way of mercy meant in the wake of another shooting in another school. The evil and the chaos of the pre-flood world doesn't seem so distant sometimes. We know that the suffering children and parents and teachers and friends need our mercy. We even know that there are some difficult demands on us as Christians for mercy for the twisted soul of the murderer. But I also wonder if nearly every Nicholas Cruz also carries a familiar good guy, bad guy narrative in his mind. A warped vision and a misdirected will to set this world straight again. It seems to be alive in so many of these killers. And so maybe some small part of the healing of this violent world needs to begin in me as I let aside that comforting but inadequate distinction between the good guys and the bad and take up the more difficult work of learning the merciful heart of God. Almost 1,400 years ago, Isaac of Syria wrote this: "What is a merciful heart? It is a heart on fire for the whole creation, for humanity, for the birds, for the animals, for demons, and for all that exists. For this reason, such a person offers up tearful prayer continually, even for irrational beasts, for enemies of the truth, and for those who harm her or him, that they be protected and receive mercy. And in like manner, such a person prays for the family of reptiles, because of the great compassion that burns without measure in a heart that is in the likeness of God." I'm not so sure about the reptiles, but surely Isaac was right. For my heart to take on the likeness of God's, I may have to give up some of this overactive imagination of mine, the one that's forever fantasizing about how to right what I think is wrong with you, or with my neighbor, or with my enemies, or maybe with anybody but myself. I may have to let go of my comfortable good guy, bad guy narrative of the world and enter a story of a God whose grieved heart hung that bow in the clouds forever and chose the way of mercy.